This goes right back then again to Newton's only prophetic work that was published, and that's the observations of Daniel and St. John, the prophecies. And when he focuses on both of those prophets, he says that they're almost like mirror images of each other, one in the New Testament, one in the Old Testament, both addressing primarily the second coming of Christ, and both being probably the most time-oriented prophets in each testament. And he was trying to understand how Daniel and John both realized this timeline in the future with the backdrop of the temple. In Daniel's case, though, he was praying towards the temple when he was actually given information by these angels to write his prophecies. And in the case of John, he was taken into this realm of heaven where the backdrop was the temple, and so he focused on this. Then going to chronologies of the ancient kingdoms that Newton wrote, having inserted the temple right in the middle of the reign of Babylon and Persia, that is where the key actually hits, because that's where Daniel was. That's where Daniel had made his prophecies. That whole scenario of the fall of Babylon was, it actually occurred the night that Belshazzar was having a great feast. And these things would go on for days and days. And at the point where all the attendants of his party were very well inebriated, he brought out the temple treasures and the goblets from the temple that had been ransacked by his uncle, Nebuchadnezzar, and started toasting his gods with it. And when he did this, this disembodied hand came and wrote on the wall many tekel parsing, which is Aramaic. And Daniel was the only one who could interpret what was on the wall. And in fact, he'd actually been made head of the court astrologers and magi in Babylon, still being a Jew, still being a religious Jew and a prophet. Here he has been set in this place above all these pagan astrologers because he had the most understanding. And that was actually brought to Belshazzar's attention by his wife, that Belshazzar had forgotten. It was too inebriated to understand. But the amazing thing about this is that is a time signature. The actual writing on the wall is not only what it was metaphorically, as Daniel has interpreted as the kingdoms weighed and divided and given to the Medes and Persians. You can actually find forms of the name Media and Persia in many tekel parsing. The parsing means to divide. Persia from the same exact root, but they're monetary units. And a mina is, if you look at the very basic measurement for money in Babylon, it was a gera, and a gera was like a penny to us. So a mina was 1,000 geras, and peres, or the word for the root Persia, actually means to divide. So if you divide a mina, you have 500. And a tekel is just like a shekel, even today, it's 20 geras. So the number is 2,520.
Let me just mention that in my background research of doing this information, which you had shared with our show many years ago in your work, there is a guide earlier in Ezekiel where actually this is all temple money, and it actually gives the conversion rates in the earlier chapter in Ezekiel. So you can go back and verify what Brother David is telling us right now, and you can actually translate it all very easily back into these minas and shekels into the geras that you're talking about. So you have independent verification there, right there in the same general books of the Bible.
Yeah, and you can find in James Strong's exhaustive concordance in the back, he has it all lined out, and you can find this for yourself, that it was exactly that number, 2,520. Well, that's the number of days in the 70th week of Daniel. It's repeated again in Revelation, and so this is what Newton was on to. But the most amazing thing from this is we know the date of the fall of Babylon was 539 BC, 538, 539 BC, just within that ballpark range. Cyrus the Great supposedly let the Jews go back into Jerusalem around 538 BC. And what's an amazing thing is, if you think about the rebirth of Israel in 1948, Newton actually predicted this. in his observations of prophecies of Daniel and John. He said that he believed that Israel had to be reborn, and that the Jews had to actually own the real state where Jerusalem is, for the temple to actually be built again. And he thought that would happen sometime in the future. He didn't know how, but he thought some other nation would probably be friendly to them and cause this to actually happen. In 1948, it actually became a reality. That was 2,486 years after the fall of Babylon. What's an amazing thing is, if you take that number, 2,486, and multiply it times 365, and equaling the days of the year, and divide it into 360, which is what you see the prophetic years actually meted out in the Bible. You actually see it over and over again. And you see it again in Revelation, this idea that a year only has 360. Mm-hmm. You end up with 2,520, 360-day years from the fall of Babylon to the rebirth of Israel. So this number stands out, again, as something extraordinary. And, in fact, I found a metrologist, one guy, Flanders Petrie, who actually wrote a book called Inductive Metrology. He spent decades working out ancient measurements and finding out what the different national cubits were from Babylon, from Syria, from Egypt, the sacred emperor fame for each of these countries, and especially for Israel. And he found that the sacred cubit in the earliest times, the time of Moses, was equal to 25.20 inches in our modern calibration.
Brother David, if I could elaborate just a little bit further on the story in Daniel that you just shared. When you told me that before on air, just sort of as an aside on our show when you called in once, and I became fascinated with that. When I went back in Bishop Usher's information to show their best estimates and other references I found on when the actual fall happened when Cyrus entered the city, and I projected that forward. In fact, I was able to put it there in mid-May 1948, the time of the founding of Israel, using a 365-day. And what I found curious is why to use that when I look at a whole different technique, taking someone like Grant Jeffrey, where he looks at the prophecy of Ezekiel, where he had to lay on one side for 360 days and the other for 70 for the sins of Israel and for Judah. And then he uses this technique after the original 70 years of punishment. They still were not repentant, so the penalty was 70 times, or 360 times 7. From the date of when they were released until it goes forward, he also ends up at the same point using a 360-day calendar. So whereas you use it from a whole different technique, looking at the Cyrus, when Cyrus entered the city, it arrives at the same date as when Grant Jeffrey looks at the return, but also uses a 360 instead of 365. And I thought there has to be some kind of connection here between the two. So then I began to look at who originated the 365-day calendar. Do you know who began that?
No, I'm not.
Cyrus. Cyrus, king of Persia, was the inventor of the 365-day calendar.
Really?
And in fact, I found on an Iranian site that was one of their great contributions to civilization was King Cyrus in an Iranian website talking about the glories of Persia, was that he invented that. So when I presuppose, trying to put my David Flynn thinking cap on, is that while Israel was under the domain of the calendar of whoever they were subject to, that's when those prophecies are according to that calendar, whereas once they were freed and allowed to go to their own land, they reverted back to the 360-day calendar. But in either case, both of them end up with the same endpoint.
Well, in this calendar system, it's an amazing thing because you go back between the 365 and the 360, you'll find amazing numbers that will show up in prophetic symbols, and that's actually especially in Revelation. 144,000, the number 666, 2,520, and its half, 1,260. I've actually looked at the Unger's Bible Dictionary for the altitude of Mount Zion, where the temple is, and they say it's 2,520 feet above sea level. And And Eratosthenes, who supposedly measured the circumference of the Earth using Greek stadia, came up with the number 252,000 stadia for the circumference of the Earth. And the way he measured it was from, he knew the distance between Syene and Alexandria in Egypt as at 5,040 stadia. Well, 5,040 stadia is twice 2,520. And it's such a big deal about 2,520 that I thought that Newton would have figured this out. And he actually said, there's a statement that he makes, that he thinks that the ancient Greeks had a much easier system of reckoning the distance of the Earth than they actually conveyed, or even what Eratosthenes conveyed. But he never actually pinned it down. I think I have, which is actually, it sounds like delusions of grandeur, but here it is. If you take 2,520 times pi, you get the actual mean diameter of the Earth, 7,916. You can actually go to Google and type in 7,916, and it'll show up as the mean diameter of the Earth in statute miles. In the case you want to find the circumference of the Earth, the mean circumference or the average circumference of the Earth, you multiply that number again, 7,916 by pi, and you get circumference. So not only is the number repeated, 2,520 repeated over and over again in the Bible, which is basically 7 times 360, but you can actually find it in the actual dimension of our Earth. And the moon, at apogee, its farthest distance from us in its orbit around the Earth, is 252,000 statute miles. Now that repeats itself throughout not just the dimensions of the Earth, and now we're kind of actually going out into the solar system. You can find this dimension in time also, and this is where the book focuses, because when I started thinking of the Earth is actually being a created thing, but if the actual Temple Mount is somehow apart from it, apart from creation and apart from time, as the Jewish sages say, a place where God in eternity is actually dwelling, then maybe time and space from around it, like Newton suggested, at least internally, maybe externally, there would be some correlation. And that's the case. Because if you go from Babylon, that fell in 539 BC, and you extend a line to Jerusalem, where the Temple Mount is, you find that it's 539 statute miles away. And so it's repeating.
Now, let me make sure people understand statute miles. Statute miles are a ratio of the actual size of the Earth. So it's no relic of some kind of unique measuring unit system of any culture or anything like that. It's sort of transcendent and cultureless, correct?
Well, it was actually set by statute by Queen Elizabeth in the 1500s with her help from Mercator and Dr. John Dee, who was an incredible occultist.
Right.
But through the work that Mercator, he started the Mercator diagram map, a great traveler, navigator, he was probably working from the works of the Greeks, and he had to establish this distance according to the ancient system. And there's a lot of ways of actually looking at how he came up with how many feet were in a statute mile, 5,280 feet.
Well, that's interesting. You mentioned John Dee because he reports that he had a scrying partner who went to try to get information from angels. He was sort of hitting up at his limits of being able to get the limits of what they could get in science, and he wanted to get angelic information. And I wonder if any of this, because I know sometime after this era of his time, he got to be a marvel in navigation and was really set the stage for discovering the New World, which I'm sure if you had a key to unlock the dimensions of the Earth, that would certainly help you in navigating remote parts of the globe. So do you think all this is connected to maybe a supernatural source of reintroducing
I think it is. I definitely think it is.